I don't know what to say. I'm going to tell you the truth. I've been prancing around while you've been talking. I'm very nervous. And I'll tell you why. Because I'm talking to my peers. I'm talking to teachers. And you know as much as I know, if not more. You certainly know more about what's going on in your country than I do. And I have the deepest respect for anybody who commits their life and their professional work to the education and the nurturing of children. So I commend you all. You're all stalwarts, and I think you're going to need your courage here. I want to start, though, first of all, by saying kia ora. Kia ora. And I'm taking as my theme the centre of the storm. And as I've outlined in my abstract for this presentation, primary school teaching in England and primary school teachers are in an unprecedented period of reform. What's it like? What's it like to be a teacher in the eye of the storm? What's it like to be a teacher in the current policy context? What's it like to be a primary school teacher in a challenging school in these policy times? In my presentation, I'm going to draw on a small number of interviews with what we call head teachers and you call principals, and I'm going to draw on the views of a few classroom teachers to try and explore what it feels like to be a teacher, what it is like to do teaching in these complicated times. Now, I've said that these are impossible times. They're times, to me, that seem to be trying to change what the work is of a teacher and what it is to be in a school. I'm starting with a quote from Michel Foucault, which I will be coming in and out of. And Michel Foucault says that, when we're actually looking at how power works, and let's say the chief function of education reform is to train people, he says this sort of training, this discipline, makes individuals. It's the specific technique of a power that sees teachers, individuals, as objects and instruments of its exercise. Now, it's not a triumphant, coercive power, because then we'd be able to stand up to it. It's a modest, suspicious power, which functions as a calculated but permanent economy. And I know that sounds a little bit dense and complicated, but I'm going to be coming back in and out of that. I'm using this as a touchstone for the arguments I'm going to be making with you this morning. And before I explore what it's like being at the centre of an almost perfect storm of reforms to primary education and what it means for some primary heads in England, I want to start by giving you a flavour of the storm itself, the policy storm. So in the first part of my talk, I want to pick up on that first quote and have a look at how disciplinary power is being exercised through the talk, particularly of a crisis, which then functions as a calculated but permanent economy in the English primary school setting. Then I want to describe some of the political and policy outcomes that are transforming the social context of public welfare provision in England. As I've said, for some time, English primary schools have been subjected to an almost continual flow of educational reforms aimed, as here, at raising standards, improving literacy and numeracy, and other forms of curriculum interventions. And this tsunami of reforming education has accelerated over time since the Conservative governments of '79, through the Labour governments of '97 to 2010, and now into our current Conservative coalition government period. I'm not going to give you a blow-by-blow account of all of this change, because even if I did have enough time, I'm not sure my audience here would be much interested in parochial developments in England. But what I am going to do is carve out some of the fundamentals of reform that do have echoes elsewhere, highlighting the main discourses that are woven into this reform agenda in English primary schools. The reforms that we've seen are carved out of two main discourses. The first one is a discourse of derision, a derision about the alleged failings of what's commonly called progressive education. And the argument is that progressive education stalks our primary schools, and it's that that's causing the problem, according, of course, to some of our mainstream politicians. And the second dominant discourse, which everybody's talked about here this week, is the call for a neoliberal, marketised approach towards public sector provision. and that is the best way to raise standards. So the power of these discourses is that they make certain things seem natural and common sense, and because they become so dominant, other things become invisible or marginalised or sidelined. So I want to start with discourses of derision. Now, for a short time, and very briefly in England in the 1960s, English primary schools were seen as progressive. We were the Finland of primary education in the 60s. People used to come and see our primary schools and see child-centeredness and creativity. And even though a lot of it was rhetoric rather than practice, nevertheless, since this time, there's been discourse after discourse, politicians saying that the problem with the primary school is they're all too progressive, they're not teaching the kids anything, they're out there playing with them in the park, they're not actually teaching them to read and write. And at regular intervals, the media has been caught up in circulating these sorts of allegations of children failing to read and write because of the stultifying culture of progressivism. And from time to time, individual primary schools have been picked off by the media, and they've gone in and they said, you know, all this school does is drumming or Indian stick dancing. They're not teaching anybody anything. So we've had shock stories about schools. In September of 2013, Michael Gove, our current Secretary of State for Education, said in a speech to the Policy Exchange, and he's a very inventive, thoughtful, well-educated man. And he's talking about, you know, Emile, written by Rousseau. And he said, Rousseau wrote in Emile, quote, "Let a child know nothing because you've told him, because he's learnt it for himself. If you ever substitute authority for reason, the child will cease to reason. He'll be a mere plaything of other people's thoughts." That's what Rousseau said. And Gove goes on, various so-called progressive thinkers have taken up this same position. And these arguments have been pernicious in crucial areas like the teaching of reading, for example, where research, he goes on, has consistently and comprehensively shown, both in this country and around the world, that systematic phonic instruction is the most effective way, blah, blah, blah. Now, I don't wish to deal with the arguments that he's being made here for synthetic phonics, and I'm not actually even going to pick up the consistently and comprehensively thing about research, but these claims have, of course, been contested by many researchers in my country and in your country as well. My point, though, is that this sort of statement typifies the continual deployment of discourses of derision around primary school teaching in England, and it demonises certain ways of teaching. These are transgressive teachers who are doing this. These aren't the sort of teachers that we want. And it means, in other words, that he's headlining what Ken Jones in my country calls a cultural nostalgia for an older way of teaching, teaching by rote, teaching for tests, teaching children to learn vast chunks of poetry. I'm not against learning poetry. I think it's wonderful, but I think there are other things as well as. And this older version of how to learn and how to teach crystallised in the Raising Standards discourse. And so what happens is we've got a similar discourse, which is a discourse of crisis around the basics of literacy and numeracy in primary schools. Do you really believe 20% of children in my city can't read or write? I mean, exactly. But what does a headline like that say to parents? Right. So we have these discourses of derision around what's happening in primary schools. No minister can afford to neglect these discourses, these things coming out in papers that are very influential. All ministers have to respond to this. And so, in a sense, the result has been a series of policy interventions into primary schools in these heated and I would say probably overcooked areas of literacy and numeracy, alongside accelerated calls for accountability and blame. And while literacy and numeracy have received the most attention, other matters have become less central to the primary school. Margie actually put it to me the other day, and she talked about it, and she said, good learning is about children learning about who they are. That's what Margie said, and I think at the core of it she's right. But helping to develop good people, thoughtful people, people who are learning about who they are and who they are becoming, those are the sort of people who actually won't become a mere plaything of other people's thoughts, perhaps. Perhaps those people are dangerous. Turning to discourses of neoliberalism, there are two key features that have resonance in the English primary school. There's been the insertion of market forces as an antidote to alleged poor standards, the market fixing the problem of state schooling, and there's been a very serious relaxedness about who provides education, private, of course, being best and preferred. How should schools be run? Should they be run by a myriad set of various private and independent privates? We have Pearson in London, across the river from where I work. And the arguments that underpin this suggest that public service education developed and delivered by people like you and me is of low quality. It's unresponsive, it's risk-averse, it's stultified. And the neoliberal solution is to open up education to markets, to parental choice, and to competition, and to allow new providers in, as David has told us about New York, including for-profit providers. How can you make a profit out of special educational needs? Morally, how can you do that? How can you make a profit? We've now got private people providing education for what we call looked after children, children in care of the state because their parents are at that moment unable to provide that. How can you actually make a profit out of those sorts of children? Is there not something distasteful? However, in English education, I now want to sketch in the political context that shapes what it is that we do, because we all know politics matter and they matter big time. In 2003, Tony Blair, who, fabulous photo, fabulous man, basically, but this is it. Education is our best economic policy. This country will succeed or fail on the basis of how it gears up to this economy. Education is now the centre of economic policy. That's what our Prime Minister said then, and it hasn't differed. Sally Tomlinson in our country has traced the avalanche of reforms that have come out in relation to this, characterising the pull-out of welfarism in our state sector, what we now call post-welfarism. Competition, the market commodification of education, the rhetoric of raising standards, emphasis on regulation, inspection, assessment, the modernisation of teachers, regular reforms to the curriculum, cutting back of local democratic accountability, performance-related pay, vast attempts at producing, monitoring and surveying the work of teachers in schools. A panoply of targets driving all policy before them. I hope you get my joke here. One policy to drive them all. Hey. Thank you. Into all this policy maelstrom stepped our new Conservative-led coalition government. Now, its intentions are very different. We're going to redistribute power. She's looking quite unbelieving, isn't she? The eyes of children. We're going to give power from the centre. We're giving it to local people. People are going to have the opportunity to control their lives. Great. Fantastic. Everybody would vote for that. Great. But the coalition government have foregrounded the redistribution of power in this way, arguably giving some people the capacity to shape their own destiny, allegedly giving power to individuals, making it easier for people to take over state-run services. As Stephen Ball says, the coalition government are going to achieve change by reducing and stripping out regulation, giving schools and principals more autonomy, and allowing even greater diversity and a much greater emphasis on consumerism. So what we have is what we've heard about already here. In my country, edu-business is flourishing. There's loads of additional classes. Parents are frightened. If you were worried that your child wasn't going to make the grade, you'd be buying a private tutor for your child, maybe on a Wednesday night to do maths, maybe on a Friday night to do a bit of language work. Then you'd be sending them to Mandarin classes on Saturday, flute in the afternoon, followed by their homework on a Sunday, and then back into school on Monday. There is a very, very big business. Hey, if anybody wants to pack up teaching and come to my country, if you set up a private business in coaching, you'll make a bomb. So there you go. Don't come. Stay here, it's much nicer. In parallel to all of this, we have the growth of the entrepreneurial head teacher and the celebration of hero entrepreneurs as models for school leadership, We have head teachers. There's one head teacher in London near to me who actually has built a building and a swimming pool, which he lets out to other people. He lets rooms in the building to his teachers. He makes business out of that. He bidded because he wanted to develop his own boarding school in the country where he was going to take kids to, but he got scuppered at that point. A very good friend of Michael Gove. He's seen as the ideal principal. He's making money and making a big profit for himself, so I shan't name his name. So what we're actually seeing in England is the rise of new kinds of actors and organisations, chains and international for-profit people migrating from business and bureaucracy, bringing with them new values, new languages and new practices. There's been a continuing concern with the raising standards discourse and checking that this is being brought off more competitively. And in this competitive setting, private providers are often seen as better than our state teachers and the state in making a difference. So what we're seeing is a hybrid state that's developing in England, where the central state is divesting itself of responsibilities for overall planning through establishing new schools and new chains of schools that are independent of the local state, yet paradoxically still asserting its capacity to control. It's a very contradictory thing. You've got the freedom, but no, you haven't. So Peter Mortimer, a very strong defender of education, has just had a book out at the end of the year, and he's saying this is what's happening. Competitive behaviour by school head teachers and governing bodies, that's your parent groups, has been incentivised so that they vie with each other for pupils and resources. Ministers appear to believe that only the stiffest competition is going to bring around school improvement, and yet that they're going to give extra powers and feed extra funds into their favourite types of schools. The favourite ones are academies and free schools, regardless of whether we need them or not. Now, these new schools don't have to follow the national curriculum. So you have to say, well, do we have a national curriculum if up to half of our schools don't have to follow it? That's an interesting question. They don't have to employ qualified teachers if they don't want to. So that's a very interesting role for a head teacher to use their money in a certain way. They don't have to stay in the family of the local authority. They don't recognise unions if they don't want to. But all schools are subject to Ofsted inspections, and if they do very badly, then they can be forced to move away from the control of the local authority and become an academy school. So what price parents' autonomy? What price this rolling back of the state where if you want to choose to do something, you can have it? In England, school performance is measured by comparing children's attainments, as you know, and then drawing up league tables, as you know. Schools are inspected by national inspectorate teams, contracted out to private providers, like Pearson. So that's all gone private. And the schools are graded as followed. 1 is outstanding, 2 is good, 3 requires improvement, and 4, inadequate. How would you feel if you were a parent and somebody said, the school that you like and love and the teachers who you care for are inadequate? Is that a way to help people improve, by saying you're inadequate? However, the government requires every school which goes into these sorts of lower categories to become a sponsored academy. And this has caused concerns in England about issues of control, democracy and parent power. There are examples, as we see here, of parents opposing becoming academised, but in cases like this, autonomy and freedom suddenly become severely curtailed, and paradoxically the role of the central state, as opposed to the local state, expands significantly. So the Coalition Secretary of State for Schools has intervened directly in certain cases, with one of the most notable first examples, Downhills, where Gove was seeking to enforce transition to academy status. And there are a number of public accounts of this process. The views of the parents opposing this move are carried on the Anti-Academy's website. But the parents' views were not upheld, and the parents voted by a majority to stay in the local authority with their head teacher, and they had already made improvements, but that was overlooked because there is a compulsion to make more and more schools into academies. Now, I started my talk with a quotation from Foucault, the chief function of the disciplinary power is to train. What we're seeing is an attempt to reconfigure what it means to be a teacher, what it means to be a good school, and teachers are being trained in this new regime of truth. Melissa Benn says that there's a distinct lobby that finds regular expression in our newspapers and editorials. And this lobby claims, quote, it's low teaching standards, lax discipline, all due to, guess what? Progressive education. It's always there. It's progressive education, what did it? And this has led to, quote, generations of failure, particularly among poorer children. And Ben argues that the outward expression of this constant vilification of state schools is measured in increased exam pressure, new schools and further privatisation, driven by a climate of fear, doing untold damage to the daily working lives and the spirits of thousands of teachers and schools up and down the country. A training through fear and a training in repression. I talked to one of your colleagues, Ricky Shetterline, and he said, what we're looking at is the insidious nature of reform. And I so agreed with what he said, I wrote it down. So I've sketched in, and I have sketched it in because there are lots and lots of stories here. I've sketched in the background to what is really impacting on teachers. How would you feel in a situation like this? Is Amy in the room? She was frightened to face... I thought you were frightened to face me up. Amy, do I speak the truth? Is it sad? Are there not still some fabulous schools and fantastic teachers, stalwarts of education? I didn't hear you. Hooray! So what is it like if you're a teacher in this setting? What does it feel like? What does it mean for the English primary school? For some time, primary school teachers, indeed all teachers, secondary ones as well, have been subjected to the discipline and training of managerial discourses as well as the imposition of a performance culture. And the consequence has been that the primary school teacher is faced with constant demands to perform and demonstrate their achievement. And Jill Forrester says, well, the thing about this is that it valorises performance and it devalues or makes invisible the other important things of teachers' work, which might be conceptualised as caring activities. The sorts of things that we've heard, the sorts of things that I heard when I went round on the tables and heard about the wonderful things that, Peter, you're doing in your school and other people are doing in their schools. So she actually says that teachers are now involved in a wrestle with the demands of performing, doing your best for the inspection regime. If you're in a school and the inspectors are coming, you all hold together and do your best, don't you? Of course you do. But you're also trying to hold on and do your best for the children simultaneously. And what she actually says, and I think it's very interesting, she says it's not one or the other. We met the minister the other day and she said it's not and or, she said it's and. And for teachers it is and, isn't it? We have to do both. That's the nature of the job. But she says that the problem is that teachers then feel they're not trusted, they feel that they're in a tightly managed set of constraints. Let's have a look at what one of the teachers actually said. The kids come to us when they're 4, and they're whole little people, All their skills are there, well, most of them, and that's what's satisfying. And now when Ofsted comes in and the whole school is judged, nobody ever looks at a school and says how well that school turns a child into a whole person. And that's what's so important, isn't it? The atmosphere, the ethos of a school, that's not advertised about a school, not anymore. It used to be, but now it's all statistics and benchmarking, and it's wrong. It's about raising standards and performance, business jargon. Stephen Ball says that when we're talking about those of us who work in education, and he includes people who work in colleges and work with teachers in that level, everybody who works in schools, parents who come in and help us in our schools, all of us, he says the danger is that as we get involved in the rewards and punishments of performance, it empties our soul. We become transparent. They can see what we're doing, but we become emotionally empty. We become unrecognisable to ourselves. Let me provide you with 2 examples of this emptiness. We all know in December the PISA results came out, and we've been talking about that quite a lot here, haven't we? Well, PISA came out, and there was a lot of reports in our newspapers about, we're going to hell in a handcart, those lousy teachers, what are we going to do, we're on the road to rack and ruin, woe is me, those dreadful teachers. We had all of that sort of stuff, as you would predict. And then the interesting thing was that the consequence was that the weakest teaching, Mr. Gove told us, was now in the first 3 years of primary schooling. Well, hey-ho, off we go. So now we're going to have national testing reintroduced for 7-year-olds after a very long campaign of teachers to get rid of it. Well, you know we test them at 5, don't you? And you know we test them, and we test them, and we test them, and we test them, and we test them. So now we're going to test them again at 7. National testing. And what actually happened was a letter appeared in the Guardian newspaper on Saturday the 14th of December. And it's just really funny. This guy, Mike Hind, I don't know who he is. This is the letter. I don't know what the latest league tables tell us about the current state of primary education, but this is what I heard last week, and this says it all for me. Quote, "My child brought home a Christmas card he'd made for me at school. On the back was a typed message. Stop is right." And second, we have a lot of marvellous teachers setting up blogs. And this is from the Secret Teachers blog. And the Secret Teachers school, it's primary school, they were expecting Ofsted any day. They give you like a day or two's notice. So somebody's always by the phone, because if the phone rings, you have to answer it. And you know after Wednesday night, they're not going to phone. So from Monday to Wednesday, there's something, it's awful, but that's what you do, yeah? That's what you do. Anyway, with 5 days to go, we're all counting down to Christmas. It's coming up to the end of term. They could come the last 2 days of term. We're looking forward to the exciting things that we've got planned for next week, except they won't happen, we're told, if Ofsted comes. Children's Christmas parties? Cancelled. Fun craft activity? Cancelled. Staff Christmas dinner? Cancelled. And instead, we've had to revert to our normal timetable that we submitted at the beginning of the year. In fact, when I asked the question of what happens if I want to do an impromptu circle time to address something that's come up in the class, I was told, quote, "Look, for these 2 days you'll have to put your professional judgment aside." My point is, overall, in my country, test scores are rising. Children are doing better than they've done before. We've actually got more children enjoying school and being happy. I think that's a great bonus. But we're doing better than we did. And things are getting better to some extent. But I feel like I'm in Alice in Wonderland. No one wants low standards. Do you want low standards? Have you ever met a teacher? I want my children to really do badly, and I'm really interested in making sure that none of my children are successful and everybody underachieves. I mean, who's met that teacher? Who is that teacher? However, increasingly, we have to drive our provision through testing, limiting our curriculum, limiting what we do, and seemingly doing better, and still doing worse. It's an impossibility. So, what is it like for the urban primary school? And I want to try and talk about how this pressure to perform functions as a calculated but permanent economy, as Foucault says, in the context of the challenging urban school. Now, what is it like to be a challenging urban school in my country? Probably exactly the same as your school. Challenging schools will probably have several characteristics, maybe high numbers of children from working class backgrounds, many of whom will qualify for free school meals, which is our proxy for social class and children from low socioeconomic backgrounds. We may well have urban schools will be supporting many more children with what we call EAL, which is English as an additional language. These schools are likely to have children who are sicker because they're living in damp housing and they're not eating proper breakfasts. And you know we have more and more food parcel distribution centres being set up in our cities all over the land. Shame on us that that's how we're feeding our children. Shame on us that that's how we're feeding our poorest families. These schools will have a higher than average turnover of teachers and children. Not every inner city school will be like that, but a lot of them will recognise these qualities. Now, policymakers often make policies as if every school was hunky-dory and it was all okay. And as Martin's work with Ruth Lupton has actually shown us, local conditions make a considerable difference to school processes and children's achievements. We know it, but we ignore it. Each of these features of challenging schools means that you have to do something different. It's that little bit harder to get that journey started down the road. And what you actually get is an increasing workload for staff that wouldn't be experienced in schools with more socially advantaged intakes. I heard one of the teachers here say, oh, you know, where I live, there's a school in a very poor area, and if we have a school fair, we make maybe a couple of $100, and there's another school, and they have a school fair, they make maybe $10,000. That's the difference. That's the difference that we're talking about here. So teaching and learning in challenging schools in high-pressure policy contexts is at least stressful and somehow, sometimes overwhelming. So I want to draw on a number of interviews, and I'm not arguing that everybody is like this and these stand for everybody. They're illustrative of the emotional life of being a teacher in a primary school in impossible times. That's all I'm trying to do, and you could find other bits of evidence, but I've spoken to a lot of teachers. Not everybody will share these feelings, but many will. And I think that the reason that teachers cope is because of this. And this is the stalwarts that are in the room and are in my country still. Teaching is good people doing good work, is it not? And this can mean that you hang on, and it can encourage you to stay, and you can keep trying to make a difference, even in the most impossible times, and maybe because of those impossibilities. Because if you go, who will be left? So that's what the situation is like for people in our schools. So what's it like for head teachers? And I'm going to start with a photograph of one of our praised head teachers. She won the National Award for Lifetime Commitment to Schooling. Susan Seifert, one of our most wonderful head teachers, been in primary schools for 3 million years, still fighting for education, still a marvellous head teacher. Now, when we talk to heads who work in challenging schools, the sorts of people who work in these schools often have an affinity with the local area. They have a commitment to the community. They are of the community. They put their kids in that school. They live in the area. It's not a school out there for somebody else's children. It's a school for their children. They speak of my kids, my school. And these people wrestle with performance as well as the demands of the job. James Trusty, a teacher that I interviewed, said, you know, we do the best we can, but not at the expense of learning and creativity. Remember, for some of our kids, school is the one place in their life, yeah? It's the one bit in the day that holds those kids together. They get a hot meal, they get care, and they get enrichment. They get to find out who they are. We've got to build on it. Yeah, we have to do what we have to do, and it gets out of hand. But, you know, it's a tension. It's really hard, and maybe we're still caught up in it. Now, that's a very good example of the wrestle that I talked about. And he does recognise what his parents and families are going through. And he says, you know, there's loads of research that says parents are central, and they are. But some of our families are vulnerable. The housing around here ain't great. It's hard to access good health and dentist care. It can be a tricky area. I mean, some of the estates are tough places to try to raise kids. And these parents are really giving it their best shot. They come in here, they see what their children are doing. They really, really want them to do well and be happy. But how to say this? So many things get in the way. Some of our mothers face obstacles and hurdles that would crush the strongest hearted, and they keep going. And he recognises that. With Simon Pratt-Adams, a colleague back home, I interviewed a small number of differently experienced head teachers. And the most experienced were very pragmatic and managed to cope with it. And they were able to stand against the storm. You know that, I've learnt it now, drop, cover, hold. They didn't drop, they stood. They covered the others, and they hold, some of our great principles. And they say things like about what's going on. Well, you know, these sort of targets and things, they're not really that helpful. I mean, yeah, our cohorts vary quite a bit. If you've got children coming in, if you're taking what we call refugees and you call accepted refugees, is that correct expression? When they've been accepted. I can't remember, I did speak to a teacher, I went to her group the other day. But anyway, when we have children coming in and then they get rehoused, you can have a school where 30% of the children move in 1 year. So if you're doing tests year on year, it's not the same kids. So your cohort tests don't really mean anything. You know, this head, Ralph says, I don't object to testing children. It's what they do with the information. And some of the journalistic phrases, it's like the fortunes of a football team, the bottom of the table, you know, relegation. And many of the sorts of measures are very crude. What concerns me, he says, is schools are doing a good job in difficult circumstances, and they end up being reprimanded. Now, you could actually say to me, you know, you've interviewed these head teachers and they're going to put a good spin on it and they're going to tell you, you know, how brave and good and courageous they are. Well, yeah, of course, but they are as well. So what about the classroom teacher? What I actually want to do now is I want to draw on a set of emails that I received between 2012 and 13 from a senior teacher who you would love. And I visited her in school, and she's like, you know those teachers, she's so good you hate her because you'd like to be like that. You know? That's Laura. And she was doing her MA with me, and during this period, she was like up at 6 in the morning, and I'm usually an early riser, and she was always there tip, and I'd get a message every day or every other day. And we both like chocolate and things, so we'd have jokes about chocolate in the morning. You know what it's like. Yada, yada, yada. Anyway, she used to email me quite a lot, and I've saved all of her particular set of her emails about the school inspection. And I think that she chose to email. This wasn't for a research project. She actually was emailing me, I hope as a friend and I hope as somebody who could be supportive. And she has given me permission to tell us a little bit about her inspections. We've had the call, and they're all reading The Teacher's Soul and the Terrors of Performativity. That's got nothing on what's happening. Without a shadow of a doubt, I'm going to do my dissertation. I'm not saying or thinking we shouldn't be accountable, but the stress this way of doing things is off the Richter scale. Alison's on the point of collapse. She hasn't eaten since we've had the call. The senior leadership are in turmoil. All the staff are crying or looking ashen or both, and we're literally terrified. You laugh about it, but is that the way to do school? I mean, you know, it's really horrendous, isn't it? So that's the 22nd of January. They're getting ready. And they're coming in. Next day, it's been a disaster. We're fighting, but they judge leadership and management. We're fighting to be judged as satisfactory and not inadequate. It's like being in an unbelievable nightmare from which there's no awakening. The team is absolutely rigorous with data. They don't care about the human element. It's one of the most horrifying experiences I've ever had. It's truly awful. I really feel if this is the way teaching is going, then all that matters is the numbers, then it's goodbye from me. They haven't cared about anything other than the data. And then on the 24th, and I'm not putting up all of her emails, I get the next email. They've gone. We've been given notice to improve. I can't imagine what Michael Goves thinks is going to be the ultimate outcome of this policy. The new framework was rigorously, relentlessly applied. They took no interest in the children. For example, a child in my class has had a brother commit suicide this term. But hey, under no circumstances must his levels drop. I truly and deeply do not believe that this new regime is going to drive up standards. And then a little bit later on, in March, in fact, St. Patrick's Day, I get another email from her. And this is really now talking about what her workload is like. And I think this is really, she's a really experienced, really capable teacher. And I don't know what you guys think about this. I come in at 7 in the morning and I'm there till 7 or 8 at night. She's got 2 grown-up children. I don't usually work on a Saturday, hey, great, but I always do on a Sunday. The new thing is, and this is about the inspection regime, and now look at the language and look at how she's internalised the level talk. Look at how she's internalised the way she's talking about her children. And you have to be able to do that. You have to speak that speech or you'll not be seen as very capable. It's nightmarish. It goes against the whole ethos of teaching. Now, this is a discipline. This is training teachers to be another sort of teacher. So you talk about, you know, they've got a 2A or God help us a 2B at Key S1 and be propelled into level 5. That's teacher talk. Or is it? And then she goes on, it all ended up fairly well. You know, we did okay. Outstanding progress in relation to our targets, and we sent packing a representative from the Department of Education who came in to wonder if he could turn us into an academy. So, hey, but look what happens. They've done okay, but, well, we've only got another visitor we've got the HMI, Her Majesty's Inspectorate, coming in September, then another inspection in the spring term to get through, and then after that, we'll be off the hook. It has to be said it was galling to see the reaction of all the officials. All they cared about was the results. And so many other things matter so much more. And she put, in my opinion, in brackets, as if she's almost like trying to deny all the things that are good primary education, that we've fought for, that we've struggled for, all of us, all around the world, in terms of primary education. So then we're waiting for the next set of inspections, and in February of this year, Meg, I'm leaving. I'll have to get out or something's going to happen to me. There's got to be a point when you say, enough's enough. I spent the whole of half-term working, except for when I actually came in to see me. No life at all, and I wasn't home until 11, and I was back again at 7:30. I feel as low as I've ever felt, and seriously need to consider the future. I'm going to end up going under. What a nightmare. We await the call, clinging to our chairs and nearly fainting every time the phone rings. Now, it could be argued that Laura's school needed some stimulus to improve, and that perhaps she and Alison weren't efficient enough, and that the school has been saved, and the children's progress is assured. But does anyone think that this is the best way to achieve these sorts of goals? What form of disciplinary power is in evidence here, returning again to the quote from Foucault that I started with? Is this modest, suspicious power, which functions as a calculated but permanent economy, going to be capable of sustaining teachers in hard-to-teach schools and ensure that we retain experienced teachers? Now, you might not believe this, but I've been put in the section of the conference called Reclaiming the Culture of Our Schools. And what I am going to finish off with is by suggesting that we do need to hold on to and reclaim the culture of primary schools. And I found this absolutely wonderful picture, and it's not a London school, as you can tell, but I just thought praise to some of the beautiful schools and some of the wonderful classrooms, and I saw a wonderful early years tape on the NZEI website this morning. Praise to the wonderful things that are going on in your schools. And what I'm actually arguing is that we need to hold on to this culture and make sure that it's not driven by international comparison, nor by political ideology, but by a much broader range of evidence related to children, the evidence that you have. Listen, I was an early years teacher. I was in what we call a reception class. I had 5-year-olds, and I had a very difficult little girl called Nikki, and she was very disruptive. And, you know, she once bit me, and I had like a little teeth mark around my hand. She was quite a difficult person. And sometimes on a day when she hadn't kicked another child, that was a really good day. So I'd say, when she'd go home, Nikki, you've been brilliant today. You've been fantastic. You've had really good relationships with everybody in the room. Well done. And that was an achievement, wasn't it? Yeah, absolutely. It was brilliant. Now, you know the sorts of evidence that relates to children and their world and their education. And, you know, we've got to have a vision that doesn't deny the need for economic competitiveness, but does believe that other educational goals are equally important. The sorts of goals I've heard you all talk about so powerfully, particularly as I've gone round the tables. My talk today has been about thinking about what it's like to do primary school teaching in impossible policy times. And teachers do need to be able to hold on. And one of the aspects that I think that is helping our teachers hold on and building resilience comes from what researchers in my country call, quote, timely support by wise leaders. Head teachers like Ralph and James and Sue Seifert. Head teachers, principals, who are sensitive to context and yet who hold on to a respectful commitment to enabling children to learn in ways that they see related to their professional knowledge about how children learn. You have a lot of knowledge. I've been very impressed I've been on a table with a young teacher, she's going to blush now, who's in her first term of teaching. She's here at that conference. There's another one in her first year of teaching. And the way they've spoken, the professional discourse that they've used about teaching and about education has been madly impressive. I wished I'd been half as good when I was their age in my early stages of teaching. You know, fantastic teachers. There's just 2 of them. The rest of them not very good. But basically, Ralph says we spend a lot of time looking at learning styles because we don't really think that, you know, it's not just literacy catch-up programs that are going to do it. We need a really good curriculum. A second aspect in retaining the culture is to keep questioning the myth that all teams stand a chance of winning, however uneven the playing field. And I think that's a fight that we have to keep making. Policymakers and reformers need to acknowledge the influence of poverty, exclusion and material lack. In the current climate, when the enabling state is in danger of serious erosion, the urban primary school is going to be on the front line of working with children and families at the sharp end of cuts and reductions in welfare provisions. These schools are going to need wise leaders. And the final point to remember is that teachers carry with them their own values and their own beliefs about teaching and learning. And they try to keep on doing a good job as much as they can in impossible times. They wrestle with performing and caring simultaneously. And sometimes this struggle becomes overwhelming. But what we have to hold on to is that, you know, in these pressures, teachers trade upon creativity and inventiveness to make things work. And what do you think happened to Laura?
She started her own house.
Peter's saying she started her own edu-business. Nah, she's still working with Alison in the same school. She's a stalwart of primary education. She's withstanding the storm. Tena kotu, tena kotu, tena kotu kato.